frequent real use is key. Getting students into actually reading stories, websites, anything with a true communicative functional value at a young age, when the students are still eager to learn, is vital. If students become used to an English learning environment where nothing builds on anything else, and they are never certain how they are supposed to be able to use what they've been taught, then they can shut off, like I said. If they can see that they can develop a certain amount of independence from the teacher in their language study, then reading can become an empowering, energizing force. Content should be engaging and communicative. It should correspond to their interests and their cognitive level. Materials must also serve a communicative function. Simply reading sentences off the board isn't enough. Picture books, for example, are a readily available tool which meets these requirements, and I can't stress their usefulness enough at the elementary level. Now, earlier I mentioned that there are skills which are critical to learning how to read and write, and I'd like to cover those in a little bit more detail. First of all, I think it's important to point out that the skills I'm going to present are not chronological or linear. They are not isolated, discrete abilities. They are complementary, with more complex skills frequently including combinations of simpler component ones. I find it most convenient to express them in terms of what students should be able to do, and this is how I will try to present them here. As they are introduced to children, they should be approached with respect to the cognitive level of the children. Also, they should be implemented in stages of gradually increasing complexity. There are drastic differences between a first grader and a sixth grader, and we have to keep these in mind when choosing materials, deciding the pacing of our program, etc. Also, ideally, the phonics program should be connected to other aspects of the curriculum. What students are learning to read should be integrated with what they're learning to talk about. I would even venture to say that their English education should be integrated topically with what the students are studying outside of English class as well. This serves to make the content more salient to the child's real-life experiences. So having said that, I'd like to now go over some of these skills here. First we have letter recognition. I've just designated subclassifications with letters, such as letter recognition A, letter recognition B there, just for reference. Letter recognition is simply being able to associate the name of a letter with its shape. In a synthetic phonics program, letter recognition isn't necessarily an essential element at the early stages of instruction, although depending on the demands or expectations of other stakeholders in the program, it may be required to teach the standard ABCs first before moving into a phonics-based program. Letter recognition A is knowing the name of the letter when it is seen. So you see this, you can say A, but you don't necessarily know that it has the sounds or different sounds. It's just the name of the letter. B is auditory. So you hear the letter name and you can identify it. So the teacher says A, they can pick it off the board, select from the group, write it, something like that. For letter production, there are 4 types of letter production skills, A through D. A is simply being able to trace a letter with a finger or pencil on paper or in the air based on a model. B is copying from a model onto paper. C is what I call letter dictation, being able to write a letter when you hear its name. A related skill would be being able to say a letter's name when it's pointed out. In this way, it's connected to letter recognition. Finally, D is phonetic dictation. This is the ability to hear a sound and be able to write an appropriate phonetic estimate. The goal here is not precise spelling. The goal is developing familiarity with the phonetic code. However, I would recommend that when using activities to develop this skill, that sounds with multiple representations be avoided as much as possible. For instance, can be represented by C, K, and Q. And after the students have developed some familiarity with the principle involved, I think it's fine to use that. But at first, it can just be confusing and be one more thing that doesn't seem to make sense to them. Making sure that the children can make sense of what we're teaching them is of fundamental importance. And because of this, it is absolutely vital to make up lists of examples to be used in games or classroom activities beforehand. Thinking of words off the cuff that only use the sounds that the students have already been introduced to can be frustrating to say the least. And if you inadvertently use too many words that they can't actually produce in activities, then it makes them frustrated. It maybe undercuts their confidence in a way that isn't necessary. Moving on. Phonemic awareness. Phonemic awareness is basically the phonetic version of letter recognition. It also is represented by a visual and an auditory subskill. Phonemic awareness is simply, if you see a letter, you know the sound that it represents. Like you see C and you can go k or S, depending on the case. Phonemic awareness B is auditory. When you hear a letter sound, you're able to identify the letter. So I say B, and you know it's B. Blending is seeing a group of letters and being able to string their sounds together properly to pronounce the word. So you see the word is a k-at, cat. Segmenting is the opposite skill. You hear a word and are able to break it into its constituent sounds. And then you can try to come up with phonetic estimates to represent the word. Like something that would be simple would be bat. So at. You think, oh, it's B-A-T. But maybe a more complicated word would be something like cat. Because then is that K, C, or is it K, or is it Q? That could be a little more complicated. Next is chunking. What I call chunking is initially being able to recognize a group of letters as representative of a single sound. Like digraphs, TH, CH would be a single sound. Or also included in that would be sight words, like the, are, of, were, whose pronunciation doesn't necessarily stick to phonics rules. And I would call this chunking. But as readers become more advanced, they can then apply, they can then be able to apply chunking rules more broadly across larger spans of text and develop scanning and skimming skills too. I think it's pretty much the same principle. Next is grammar. Grammar is a vital skill to understanding written language, but I would stress that at early stages of instruction, the detailed, explicit explanation of grammatical structures should be avoided. Of course, if the children ask a question, we should make attempts to answer it. But we should avoid getting bogged down in trying to explain words like is to a 7-year-old child. The children just won't understand, and they'll get bored and they'll shut off and start doing other things, like throw things at each other. Instead, implicit comprehension of grammar should be encouraged through the use of context clues and visual representation of text. Rather than explaining the nuances of ing, we could show children pictures which express clearly the differences of those states. And although I found in practice that students often can fill in the blanks of these structures with assumptions from their native discourse community, but they don't need to be taught explicitly. For example, when I was applying to be privately hired in NESA after my JET contract expired, I presented to the interviewer one of the books that I had been working on with my 5th grade students. And he was surprised that they could read it because it contained the past tense, something which wasn't in the curriculum at all. What I explained to him was that since the students knew it was a fairy tale, they already assumed it to be in the past tense, and they needed no correction from me. It's in this way that students can adapt to grammar implicitly, by thinking about things like how do they normally think about reading and writing in their own language? What's their cultural, what kind of cultural things can you use to help create a mirror between their language and English? But vital to this method is that they understand that when they are asked to read things, or people say things to them, that unless the other person is insane, that what they are trying to express has reason to it. That even if they don't understand every single facet of the expression, that they must try to look at what they do recognize and try to fill in the gaps with what would make sense. Of course, it also makes us responsible for ensuring that our examples are properly contextualized. And here's another example that I use with my class. I'll put up a roll of black cards on the board, and on the other side are written words in their language. Okay? So like in Japan, it'd be a Japanese sentence. And I explained to them that one day they run into a foreigner who can only utter broken phrases to them, but that he desperately needs to communicate something in their language. I then turn over the cards which are concealing grammatical elements of a sentence, like my, is, the, and ask them if they can figure out what I'm talking about. And the answer is no way, they can't. My, is, the. They have no idea what it is. But then I replace the words with cat, under, table. And then they all instantly realize what I'm talking about. And a fundamental of teaching grammar and reading comprehension implicitly is in helping students get used to the ordering of ideas in English, not necessarily in explaining complex grammatical principles that even we perhaps do not understand as well as we would like to think.